Today, I will talk about reading and memorizing all the information in the book. So, in elementary school, I think I learned Hangul and multiplication a bit late. I remember staying after school to do dictation with the teacher. Other than that, my life was pretty ordinary. But when I got to middle school, something interesting happened. I have an older sister, and I mentioned I wanted a big computer while talking one day. She jokingly said, "If you get first in your class even once, I'll buy you one." At that time, being first in class felt like a dream, something I couldn't imagine. But I really wanted that computer, so I thought, why not give it a shot? Believe it or not, I did really well on the entrance exam because many of the questions I knew came up, and I got them all right. So, true to her word, my sister bought me the computer. I was so happy, but the problem was that my abilities were revealed as soon as I started school. I wasn't a great student or anything, and I had never even taken any big tests before. But by pure luck, I came in first on a simple entrance exam. That made everyone think I was the top student in my class. But my actual skills showed when we had the real exam, and I flopped. Our teacher was really disappointed, saying, "I didn't expect this from you." It felt tough because everyone around me thought I was brilliant, and suddenly their opinions changed. So I went to ask someone how actually to study. They told me I should memorize everything if I wasn't doing well. They said memorization was key. That made me realize I had to focus on that. I opened up my middle school textbooks and memorized everything from start to finish. I could memorize things without a problem, but the tricky part was reviewing everything I'd learned from the beginning up to that point. My grades were fine, I memorized everything perfectly without missing a single detail. Not only did I memorize things, but since I kept repeating them, my grades were among the best in my class. But after about a year, it became a problem. If it took me 2 hours to memorize something today, reviewing everything I memorized over the past year would take me more than 10 hours. So, every day, I was spending so much energy on reviewing that I felt a bit obsessive about it. At some point, the pressure to memorize turned into the pressure to review what I had memorized without realizing it. In the second year of middle school, I thought I had to memorize and review everything from the first page to the last page of my first year textbooks for all my subjects. It became so overwhelming that I eventually reached a point where I just couldn't read anymore. That was during my second year of middle school. I was in a considerable dilemma where I couldn't read or memorize, but the bigger issue was how others viewed me. When I was doing well in school, my self-esteem went up, and people around me had a positive opinion of me, which made me want to keep doing well.
But instead, it had the opposite effect. People tend to think that the student is just rebelling because they're being pressured to study hard, but that's not really the case. I graduated high school without even being able to read or look at books. Whenever I tried to study or memorize something, I'd get dizzy and then end up throwing up. After graduating, I went to the hospital for a diagnosis. There was nothing wrong with my ability to memorize, but I think my memory just didn't last very long. This fear of forgetting things made me obsessed with reviewing. I kept telling myself, "I can't forget this, I must review." I think that's why I could not study long after middle school. Math was the only subject I didn't give up on in high school. I think it worked for me because there wasn't much to memorize in math. But habits can be challenging to break. Even though I tried to start fresh with math, I couldn't abandon those old habits. Back then, I limited myself to just the necessary math formulas instead of trying to memorize everything. I picked out a few key formulas to learn, and instead of going over them every day, I repeated them once a week or every 2 weeks. Once I built my confidence by knowing those formulas, I spent the rest of my time solving math problems. Thanks to that, I did pretty well on my math scores when I had to retake the exams. In the end, I managed to get into college and went through military service. And when I started my first year of college, I felt old compared to everyone else. I was the oldest freshman. Unfortunately, during my second year, a student took their own life. It was around the time of the 386 generation, and that student was involved in activism while I wasn't. Because I was the oldest, I chaired that student's funeral committee. This led to misunderstandings since the student was an activist, and I was seen as a key figure in the protests. One of my friends came over and said, "I think the police are looking for you, so you should lay low for a bit." So, I took a break from school and spent a year hiding in Silam Dong. I lived in a boarding house with 4 law students from Seoul National University and 2 engineering students. One day, while we were all having lunch together, we started sharing some fun stories. What struck me was that these law students were having deep discussions about study methods like how to study civil law and tackle criminal law. It was super interesting because, at least in my mind back then, and even now, I thought these top students from the best universities in the country wouldn't be worrying about study techniques. But they were. It hit me that there's a method to studying. After I went back to school, everything was pretty quiet. Around that time, I was also reflecting on my own career path.
I had a meeting pop up. Around that time, my brother was saying, "Hey, aren't you going to Company A?" I was like, "No way, I never said that." But then I found out he meant Group A and job hunting was tough. Considering my age, graduation year, grades, and other stuff, I realized I had narrowed down the schools where I'd interviewed. Suddenly, it hit me, what if I end up working for a company I never even thought about doing a job for? That thought freaked me out. With all this career anxiety piling up, I felt this urge to study again and get into it. I heard study methods and wondered if a way might suit me. So, I decided I needed to drop out of college to make a fresh start. This was during my senior year, second semester, just before graduation, and I ended up handing in my resignation to the school. I was ready to give the college entrance exam another shot and change my career path. The college entrance exam felt like a gift from the heavens to me. Nowadays, students have so much to do after the exam and so much to memorize for their courses. But the entrance exam wasn't one of those subjects where you had to cram a ton of stuff. I think the exam suited me well, and I really put in a lot of effort. I overcame many learning difficulties in the past, and since I knew I had a fear of memorizing and a bigger fear of forgetting what I memorized, I set limits for myself. I decided to focus on just a few things to learn and ensure I wouldn't forget them by reviewing them every 2 weeks. I made a rule not to memorize anything more than that. I tackled the rest by solving problems or reading books with that approach. I studied really intensely for a long time, and luckily, I got into Wonkwang University's medical school that year. I could have applied to several schools but decided to attend Korea University. I wasn't really satisfied with my studies. I felt like I lacked time and wanted to do it for another year. I wanted to, but I didn't have an excuse, so I just went ahead and got accepted into Wonkwang University's medical school. After that, when I got the acceptance letter from Korea University, I canceled my admission to Wonkwang and got my tuition back to register at Korea University. While attending Korea University, I prepared for the college entrance exam again, and this time, I focused on it for about 5 months. As a result, I ended up in the geography education program at Seoul National University. On my first night at Seoul National, I couldn't sleep. My peers were so much younger than me. I was 29 years old, and even the teaching assistants were younger. There was also a lecturer the same age as me, making me feel insecure. I coasted through the entrance exam, barely getting by with a slightly higher score. If I wanted to leave this university feeling accomplished, I needed to study hard. That's when I decided to put in the effort and study hard in college to make up for what I didn't do in middle and high school.
I decided to make up for my regrets about studying in college, so from then on, I focused entirely on my studies. At the same time, I started thinking a lot about how to study effectively. I tried different methods independently, figuring out what worked best for me, and gradually developed my study techniques. After that, my grades improved, and I studied more, which led to great results. By the time I graduated, I had done so well that I was the top student in my entire university. People often ask me how I started studying seriously at such a late age and achieved such results. I compare it to marathon runners. When we watch them, we think, wow, how do they run those long distances without even getting out of breath? The secret is that marathon runners know how to pace themselves so they don't get winded. Unlike sprinting, where you push yourself hard for a short distance and gasp for air, marathon running is about maintaining a steady rhythm. Running 40 kilometers isn't what makes a marathon. It's about running 100 meters without getting out of breath. then 1 kilogram, and eventually 40 kilograms. If you keep doing that, you'll get used to it, and your speed will naturally improve. Studying is kinda the same way. Instead of being scared of big, distant goals from the start, focus on what you can do now. Set small, manageable goals that aren't too tough. As you tackle those, you'll find you can handle harder stuff more easily over time. You can study or work more efficiently and effectively when you achieve more. So, I'd suggest breaking down your goals into smaller, achievable tasks. That way, you can keep moving forward without feeling overwhelmed. Trust me, eventually, you'll get there. I think you'll be able to run through the streets just as fast as a marathon. Hi, I'm Lee Dong Chan, lawyer. Right now, I'm running the Friends Law Office in Yeongji-yu, Seoul, and I'm here to share some tips on study methods. When I first started university, I studied really hard during my first semester. We usually had 1 or 2 leading textbooks and about 3 or 4 reference books for any subject, so we had to read around 6 books at most. The key to a semester is to scan a ton of books. So, what's the main point of studying in college? It's about how quickly you can read those books. I put a lot of thought into reading effectively, drawing from my experiences and what I've seen around me to develop my own methods. In education, there's something called cognitive structure and learning theory. This means that when we take in new experiences, not every student processes them the same way. It all depends on their prior knowledge.
It's about how a student's personality and past experiences shape how they absorb information internally. For example, if 3 people watch the same drama, they'll remember different things after it ends. The drama is the same, but each person's experience and understanding differ. The same goes for learning. When new knowledge comes in, it gets placed in a way that makes sense based on what you already know. Reading is perfect for this kind of self-structured learning because new books fit well with our existing knowledge since we've been reading for a long time. However, the tricky part is that until you read a book thoroughly, you can't really grasp the unknown world it presents. You have to read a bit more to dive deeper into it. It means there's a significant gap in time because self-structuring finally happens. To eliminate that gap, you create a preconceived notion about the book, like thinking, this book is probably about this. It's like making up a fake experience. Once you have that phony experience in mind, when the real experience comes in, you can compare it to the fake one. This helps you correct any misunderstandings or misconceptions you have. So, what's the reverse learning method? Instead of reading the book from start to finish, you trick yourself into thinking you've already read it. Then, as you read, you compare your knowledge and assumptions with the book's content. The reverse learning method has 4 steps. First, look at the title and summarize it. Second, check out the table of contents and rephrase that. Third, read through it while skipping parts. Fourth, do a close read. For example, if the book is about starting over, you can guess the content by looking at the title. Starting over with studying, there's this older guy who wants to find his passion, so he's getting into learning. Basically, you look at the title and summarize it, turning it into a single sentence or paragraph. It's a process that requires some imagination. Then, there's the table of contents. For example, it might have sections like getting lost in school, the start of a long journey, and new seas, new routes. Study methods for a successful college life. You summarize based only on the table of contents. So, for getting lost in school, you might write about a kid who struggled academically in elementary and middle school, acting out and not doing well. You need to present it in complete sentences as if you've actually read it and understood it. Next, the start of a long journey talks about new challenges, preparing for the college entrance exam, unexpected successes, and ongoing challenges at Seoul National University.
So, this writer returned to school in middle age and got into Seoul National University. After that, they had a pretty fun college experience. You need to create sentences like this one, doing it by section and jotting it down with a pencil next to it. Up to this point, it really requires some imagination. The third step is crucial, though it's about reading quickly. Skipping means just breezing through it, right? So, if you want to skim, read in Korean, look at the book and think about new challenges, like becoming a doctor and stuff like that. Can you believe there's no memorization for the college entrance exam? So, instead of focusing on every detail, you're just fleshing out the concepts you've already stored in your head with the titles and sections. For a book of this thickness, aim to read it in under 5 minutes, and even for thicker books, keep it to about 15 minutes max. That's what skimming is all about. After you skim, the key is to summarize what you've read alongside the main points from the table of contents. I'm writing this based only on the title, so I don't really know the content, but skipping parts means I've seen some of it. Once I finish that, I'll read the whole book slowly and thoroughly from the beginning to the end. This is the final deep reading process. When I finish this stage, I've read the entire book. This is a reverse reading method. You can read a book like this in about an hour. If you usually take 2 hours, your speed might not jump right away. But once you get used to this reading method, I think you can cut your reading time by at least 30 to 40%, and with some effort, maybe even 50%. When I first started college, I noticed that my reading speed doubled when I got to grad school. This method can be applied to all fields, including novels and major-related readings. Of course, subjects involving detailed math or computer science might differ slightly. It might be tricky sometimes, but generally, the various subjects we learn during our teenage years, language, foreign languages, social studies, and even the typical textbooks that college students use can all be applied without limits. I'm confident sharing this study method because I've seen great results. I have 9 nieces and nephews, so I share this method with them when they come to me for study tips. I've noticed it really helps them overcome their struggles. While studying education, I stumbled upon a documentary comparing study methods of college students in other countries to those in Korea. I remember it being about some Nordic countries, where they have a similar approach to studying. In their system, not everyone reads the book simultaneously. One person does a deep read while the others skim through it quickly.
The main issue here is that instead of someone who's really read the book giving a lecture to a student, it's often a person who just skimmed it, asking questions to the student who actually read it, even though they might go through this process. It seems like this way of engaging helps them understand the content better, and I think that's a solid method for structuring knowledge. If I try to read a book perfectly while skimming, it takes way too much energy. But if I skim and connect it with what I already know, I can form new ideas about the book. I can absorb the content much better by asking questions and interacting with someone who understands the material. So, I think the approach I'm suggesting could be really effective. Conversely, different reading methods can have various benefits, like speeding up how fast you read. We often misunderstand that part. You can just read the book straight through, there is no need to keep going back and forth. But if you try it, you'll see that the time it takes to read it closely is way less than if you just read it normally. If you skim the title and the table of contents, summarizing everything will take less than 10 or 15 minutes. Overall, your reading speed will really pick up. Second, you'll get a comprehensive understanding of the book. It feels like you've read it 2 or 3 times because you're flipping back and forth, which helps you remember the content better. This book has its advantages. First, it really improves your critical thinking and flexibility in thinking. Many people think critical thinking means you have to criticize others, but that's not so easy if you think about it. Why? Because of all the fixed ideas we have. Critical thinking is more about, I grow more when I criticize myself instead of others. But when I flip that around, I notice that my preconceived notions based on the title or the table of contents gradually change as I read books. I also realize that when I read similar books, I often have similar biases or fixed ways of thinking about them. This awareness allows me to challenge those ideas and try new approaches, which broadens my thinking. Another advantage is that my intuition improves. At first, my ideas based on just the book titles were vague, and the content I discovered when I read closely was entirely different. However, this insight doesn't last forever. My understanding can sometimes narrow again over time. In grad school, I was pretty good at pretending to have read books without actually doing it. If we had a little thick textbook, I'd read at least one of them thoroughly.
Sometimes I only need to read the essential parts of a book thoroughly while just skimming the rest. And that's usually enough for me to engage in conversations and discussions. I think this way helps boost intuition, which is definitely a plus. Another advantage is that since I'm constantly interacting with the material, it keeps my interest in reading alive. Generally, these are the kinds of benefits I see. I'd suggest starting with the most straightforward book you have at home for anyone interested in reading or feeling intimidated by it. You might be surprised by how much you enjoy it and discover your strengths in reading. Plus, it's not just for adults. Middle and high school students can also kick things off with lighter reads. Using this reverse reading method could really help in their regular studies, too. Hi there, I'm attorney Dong Chan, and I run a law office called the Friends Law Firm. It's nice to meet you. Let me just wrap up some notes I have from my public law classes in college. You can break it down into two main parts: first, reading the book, and second, summarizing and memorizing what you read. Now, when it comes to summarizing versus memorizing, people might have different preferences on which to tackle first. But here's a tip about memorizing. I think of it in terms of the core memorization method. So what's that? Simply put, it's about finding the most significant common factor when memorizing something. Let's say you're learning vocabulary in English. When you pick a vocabulary book, I'd suggest getting 3 different ones and only memorizing the words that overlap between them. That's the key to this method. It means you should focus on memorizing the essential bits, the minimum you need to know, while ignoring the rest. Once you've nailed those core parts, you can just let the other stuff go and move on. That's what the core memorization method is all about. No, it's about the principles of memorization. Since it's a principle, don't try to cram in everything I know. Focus on the key points and don't miss those. So, how do you create a core understanding? That's where the pyramid summarization method comes in. I will explain how I summarize and memorize what I've read using this method. So why is it called the pyramid method? At the top, you have the textbook. While you're reading the textbook, the main ideas from it and references will be organized. It could be summarized on an A4 sheet or copied directly from the book. Place an A4 sheet on one side and start organizing from the top down. First, think about the content of the first page of Chapter 1, then summarize the table of contents. After that, look at the critical points from Chapter 1, which you'll find in the references, and go through them again, focusing on that first chapter.
Starting from the first section, we'll create a summary. First, we'll have the main textbook, then outline our primary and secondary references in a pyramid shape. As we go along, we'll summarize the whole content from start to finish. Naturally, this takes a lot of time since this is exam preparation, and it can't be rushed. So, after summarizing the textbook and references, we'll call that our first summary. But we're not done yet. We'll put away the textbook and notes completely. We'll take that first summary, which could be around 50 pages or more, and read through it. After that, we'll condense it down to half. That's our second summary. We'll discard the first one for the third summary, take the second one and cut it in half again. This process can continue like this. I recommend that, especially for college courses, summarize until you can condense everything down to 1 or 2 A4 pages. I think this is the last step of the summary. So, what's the core of this subject? It could be the final point. Or if you find a suitable amount of material to study in the middle, you can consider that the core. That part definitely needs to be memorized. It might not be easy, so explain it with my example. This book is the criminal law book I first saw 15 years ago. It's really overwhelming, 950 pages. I had no idea about law when I started law school, and during my first year, I was wandering around trying to figure out how to study and wasted a lot of time. Eventually, I realized I needed to stick to what I knew, so I decided to do it my way. I watched video lectures while reading the book, then I moved on to the next round of studying, and then I did it a second time, a third time, and so on. This is the study material I used for my pyramid research during the summer break of my second year and first semester. I focused on this because I didn't study for the criminal law subject. Since I summarized it myself, I know it pretty well, right? If you look at it, it went from 950 pages down to about 40 pages. So, it's roughly 40 pages of A4 paper. This was my 4th study abroad experience, and when it came time for the exam, I just needed to review this core material. I mean, I created it myself, not someone else. If you condense the textbook, you will find the key points I have studied, so you can understand most of the earlier material by looking at this alone. It's hard to explain how you can know it just from this, but for those who have experienced it, a connection forms between the earlier content and the parts one summarized. So, even without looking at that thick book, you can effectively grasp the essential information from this.
I got to the point where I could write answers just as well as the books, and I liked criminal law the most out of all the subjects for the bar exam. The funny thing is, I studied the least for criminal law. It took me a lot of time to really grasp it, so I couldn't put as much effort into other subjects. But in the end, the subjects I spent a lot of time on and really summarized did well for me. Even though I didn't put as much time into studying the other subjects, I managed to get through my bar exam prep in about a year and a half and achieved decent results.
So, for college students or anyone preparing for big exams, it's worth investing time to focus on the essential topics and genuinely put in the effort. If you can create a solid core understanding of the subjects that matter most to you, it'll really pay off later. Many people ask me if it's really that hard or if it actually works, so I created this material to test it out. I hadn't looked at criminal law in 15 years, but using just this material, I made a study guide that's a review. It's 85 pages long, and I turned 40 pages of content into this more detailed version. Even after 15 years, when I read through the core concepts a couple of times, it all returned to me. The core understanding sticks with you, just like how the core of our body is the most crucial part. The same goes for studying any subject. The core concepts are essential. Whatever subject you're studying, make sure you grasp the core of it. If you get that down, you'll be able to talk about it later on confidently. To find the core, you can narrow down what you've learned, like building a pyramid and focusing on the key areas. I think that's what I wanted to say. I still feel that way now. I'm currently in grad school studying education, which I'll carry with me for life. I've been chatting with many university professors who mentioned that it's getting harder to evaluate students because of AI. Everyone's giving the same textbook answers, and even the model answers lack personality. In this AI era, we rely increasingly on computers for our judgments, so it's crucial to have creative thoughts and unique expressions. When we learn more unconventionally and organize our ideas like a pyramid, what we come up with is truly our own, something that no one else can replicate. It's rooted in our experiences and becomes our way of expressing things. So, in the AI age, the goal is to convey something uniquely ours that AI can't mimic, even if it tends to generalize everything.
This isn't just a common idea, I can express it through my experiences. If you study this way, you'll come up with valuable and fresh results that AI can't produce. When I think about studying, I see it in two parts. One is absorbing existing knowledge and making it my own. In this process, I sometimes read books backward or break things down into their core components. However, developing an open-minded way of thinking is just as essential. How can I improve my thought process? I often used random debate games in college, where I would take on opposing viewpoints and argue them back and forth. I thought of this because, during my time in college and grad school, I participated in debate classes, but they have their limits. Most people only defend the viewpoints they feel comfortable with. For example, when discussing racial discrimination, you don't hear many Asian voices speaking up for affirmative action. It's not uncommon for Asian people in the U.S. to acknowledge that discrimination is a serious issue. This means that it's tough for people to think outside their own fixed perspectives or challenge their group's beliefs. So even if there's a lot of discussion, research shows that it can actually reinforce a student's stereotypes. I might force myself to switch between A and B to fit in. For example, let's talk about nose jobs. If you're thinking about getting one, where would you go? A plastic surgeon or an ENT specialist? Most people would say a plastic surgeon, right? But suppose you take the perspective of an ENT specialist. In that case, you'd argue that these doctors specialize in noses and that, at a teaching hospital, they handle all kinds of surgical procedures related to noses. Local ENTs might seem to treat nasal infections, but they fall under the surgical category, so nose jobs are also part of what they do. You can argue that someone has to do it. There are counter-arguments. So, I bounce back and forth between two contradictory or opposing thoughts, exchanging ideas like a game. I mention random because it comes from not sticking to just one viewpoint. This practice can help soften rigid thinking or narrow-mindedness. I've used this method a lot while researching with my grad students, where we often switched roles to argue from opposing perspectives. It was a pretty effective way to develop critical thinking skills, and I wanted to share that. After studying, I go home and talk to myself in the mirror. I do this because even if I feel like I understand something, I often realize I can't express it well when I try to say it out loud. There's a lot we think we know ideally.
If you can explain something to someone else, it means you really know it, like 100%. But if you can't explain it, then your understanding is shaky. There's also a way to break things down into simpler, core ideas while you explain. So, I suggest you look in the mirror and practice explaining what you've learned as if you're teaching someone else. It helps you digest the material better. Now, there's something significant I want to point out. We need to break the myth of effort and the illusion of focus. That's the only way you'll be able to study deeply and for a long time. Remember that famous soccer player's foot shape that went around on the internet? People said, that's why he's such a great player. But I want to ask you, have you ever seen the foot of a failed soccer player? I bet there's no noticeable difference in foot shape between successful and unsuccessful players. I'm not downplaying the value of hard work, though. To become a pro in any field, students must put in at least a basic effort to prepare for exams. It's definitely necessary to strive to reach a certain minimum level, but if we start equating success solely with effort, it can lead to unfair blame on those who fail, suggesting they didn't work hard enough. Other essential factors come into play after effort. You might think the extra edge in effort could be the focus, but that's partly right and wrong. We often say someone is successful because they have great focus, but that's inaccurate. The right way to say it is that they have great immersion or are really good at getting absorbed in what they're doing. So, focus and immersion are different. Focus is about directing energy and willpower towards a specific task. Focusing on one thing takes a lot of energy, limiting our attention spans. Immersion is when you get so caught up in something that you lose track of time and can't think about anything else. So, when someone is really into something for hours, it's often because they've unconsciously fallen into that state, not just because they're forcing themselves to focus. What we really need to work on is building our concentration. Concentration isn't about zoning out for hours on end, it's about being able to focus for a limited time each day, like 1 or 2 hours, with intention. It's important to concentrate, but since it takes a lot of energy, we can't do it for long stretches. We should aim to gradually increase our focus time, starting with 5 minutes and working up to 10 or 30 minutes.
It's really tough to sit down and study for even an hour, especially when it feels forced and you don't want to do it. But pushing through that is actually what building focus is all about. I'm saying this because people often confuse focus with being absorbed in something. Some folks seem to have this fantastic ability to get into things, and it can be easy to envy them when you struggle to focus. But that state shouldn't be our ultimate goal. Instead, we should train ourselves to focus for short bursts, starting with just 5 minutes and gradually increasing to 10, 15, or even 30 minutes. A tip I found helpful is copying something down. It doesn't matter what book it is, grab one and force yourself to write it out for 5 minutes. Try to do it simultaneously every day when you usually study or need to concentrate. Start by taking another book and copying from it for about 5 minutes. It can be in a foreign language or your language. Just copy a bit and gradually increase it to about 15 minutes. As you keep doing this, copying will become a skill, and you'll find it easier to extend the time without feeling much resistance. Based on my experience, if you can copy for around 15 to 20 minutes, you'll notice that you can maintain that level of focus on other tasks even when you're not copying. That's how I developed a habit of concentrating for 20-30 minutes, or even an hour. I think my maximum focus time now is about 2 hours a day. If I try to push beyond that, I feel tired and a bit off the next day. So, it's important to really understand what concentration is, and to gradually build it up without being too greedy so that you can apply that focus to your life or studies.
It has been pleasant for you to follow along. Thank you for watching or listening. I hope it taught you something.